In his video workshop series on building a federal side table, furniture maker Steve Latta demonstrated a technique for joinery that yields a perfectly square table that's also easy to glue up. The key to accurate joinery is ensuring that the shoulder-to-shoulder distances are dead on. By following Steve's tips, that's exactly what you'll end up with. Take a look.
To begin our joinery, we're first going to cut our mortises, in this case using a hollow chisel mortiser. I begin by laying out the double tusk mortises. Flush the legs on top and tape them together. That way they won't slide. I want to verify the bottom of the tusks to the apron, so I'll use the apron as a layout tool. Lay the apron on the legs, slide the square to it, remove it, and make a pencil line. I'll use the actual blade to establish the length of the mortise. Set it on top, make another line. I only need one line to establish how far in the mortise goes. And because the machine really defines the offset, I only need to mark one of those to set the machine by. The next set of mortises I'm going to lay out are for the mortises that go into the back of the front legs. Those have a little different layout than the rear legs because of the double tusk in front. For those, I'm coming in 5/8 of an inch from each edge. I don't run my lines all the way out to the edge because I'll just have to take them off later on. I just put them where I need them. For the rear legs, I like to maximize the width of my mortise. The bigger the mortise and tenon joint, the more glue surface. So I'm only coming up from the bottom of the apron 1/8 of an inch on the back legs, and once again down 5/8 on the top. I'll put these lines clearly on the side, avoiding any confusion as to where it goes, and then I'll go and mortise them. I begin by cutting the mortises for the double tusk. I do the outsides first and then work my way to the middle. I do that because the bit follows a path of least resistance. If I started at one end working my way over, as I got to the outer border, the mortise would be curved, arching in. Referencing is critical on all of these. So rather than reset the offset of the bit, I just turn the leg around and cut the other side. Having repositioned the head for the apron's offset, I plunge the mortises. Once again, I do the outside first, and then I do a series of spaced cuts, plunging as I go, and then going back and clearing out between them. Having cut all of our mortises, now it's time to do the rest of the joinery. That joinery includes double tusk tenons, regular mortise and tenon joints, and a dovetail on the top of the leg. All different joints. The key here, though, is the shoulder-to-shoulder distance. So we're going to set the fence once, and then basically use that as a springboard for all of our joinery. I set my fence at about 13/16 of an inch. And then I'm going to use a miter gauge with a piece of MDF to serve as my push and my support. Because I cut my test pieces to length at the same time, I'll use these to find my shoulder to shoulder. I'm going to go ahead and make the cuts on the faces of my two lower blades. My next step is to cut the offset that we see on the sample to match the offset of the mortise to the leg. I found the height of the shoulder cut using one of my scrap pieces. First I went a little high, then I had to lower it, and I think I have it good. I'm checking for two distinct things. One, the shoulder cut, and two, how far apart the faces are. It's sort of a way of double checking your tenon. I check the shoulders, I check the faces to see if they lined up with the mortises. Once that's done, cut the actual pieces. To properly execute this dragging technique, you're just taking a little bit at a time. If you're not comfortable with this, make the shoulder cut, and then go back and make a separate cheek. The next piece to cut is the upper blades, the dovetail cut. And that's a pretty straightforward one. I'm going to cut the bottom and the two sides. The last piece to cut are the aprons with the full mortise and tenon joint. And once again, all I'm going to change is the blade height. The fence hasn't moved at all. When cutting these, what's critical is that the end of the apron is tight to the fence. If there's a gap on the miter gauge, that doesn't matter. If you're not tight, what will happen is those shoulder cuts won't be parallel. Once again, we see the importance of not moving the fence. The shoulder to shoulder between the rear apron and the front two blades is identical. That way our table is guaranteed to end up square. Because I have a different shoulder cut in the front than I do in the back, I need to sort of arrange my pieces and label them how I want them to go. By putting lines where I am clarifying the position of the board as opposed to introducing confusion. The next thing we need to do is pretty much establish the length of the tenons. On a scrap piece, I'm going to establish the height of the cut for the top of the leg, holding it up to the leg to make sure my offset's the proper distance. Now this is the point where I'm finally going to move the fence, and I'm just going to tap it in a 32nd of an inch at most. Because I did make that 32nd of an inch offset, I can cut all four of them at the same time. That same gap will work for the bottom side of the front tenons. Because I was trying to maximize glue surface, I changed the depth of the notch on the rear tenons. Having made all of the shoulder cuts, next we need to make the cheek cuts. Now to do that, I'm going to use a shop-made tenoning jig that basically mounts to the fence of my table saw. It has an arm that slides that moves the piece, and this arm travels on a groove to avoid any kind of pivoting or rocking, making it much safer. Now to do this, we just clamp it to the fence. When mounting it, we want to pay attention and make sure that it sits square to the table. From here, we're ready to go. Our next step is to work on the dovetailed pieces. And basically all we're doing here is making a shoulder cut because it's a shoulder dovetail. We need to set the blade height for this. So I'm just going to put my piece up to the saw and raise the blade. I want it coming up just short of that shoulder. I know I'm good when I'm coming right into that scribe line. Having established it with the test piece, now I'll run my good ones. Our next piece will be the double tuss tenon, and once again we're going to use the same jig. Because I can't clear the entire center with just two passes, I begin with my test piece and my good pieces by just nibbling out the center, by making a cut, flipping it, and then making the other side. Getting an exact fit takes several attempts, and when I think I'm close, I'll just make a partial cut and then fit that partial cut to the actual mortise, seeing how it looks. Once I have it, I'll then cut my good pieces. You might wonder why I'm always running extra pieces. Well, basically, all the extra pieces for this project is about 1 board feet of lumber. The machine's set, the piece is there, I might as well run it. If something goes wrong down the road and I can just pull a backup piece, I'm way ahead of the game. It's a nice tight joint, straight off the saw. The last piece we need to cut are the aprons. I started out by working my way in from each side, nibbling off a little bit. Basically, the tenon's snug, but if I forced it in there, I would definitely split the leg. This is where handwork does come into play. With our tenons roughed in, we need to final fit them. Before we do that, however, we need to make the notch cuts so they actually fit in the mortises. And for that step, I'll use the bandsaw. The last notch is just 1/8 of an inch, and that's on the back of the sides and the rear apron. When I hold it up to the leg, I want to see a little bit of a void there. I don't want to have to fight putting these things in. Having made all of our preliminary cuts on the table saw, we need to do a final fitting of the tenons on the aprons and still cut the dovetails on the upper blades. The lower blades should be ready to go. I'll begin by cutting the dovetails that fits into the top of the legs. Using a small square and a scalpel, I put a scribe line connecting the shoulders. Then, with my marking gauge, I established a length of the dovetails. With that distance, I'll go to the power miter and just cut off the end. Using a pencil with a white lead and a small combination square, I'll put a mark about 1/8 inch in from each side. 2 more marks in the center will define where the dovetails begin. Using adjustable bevel, I'll put the dovetail lines in before cutting. For marking the tails, I always use a pencil rather than a scribe. That way, if I drift from my cut at all, I don't have fibers breaking out. I don't need to correct it. At the scroll saw, I cut out my tails. In terms of sizing these tails, I really don't care if they're dead on even or not. They're at the top of the leg, and they're never going to be visible. I also do a double tail because I found a single sometimes fails over time. If somebody kicks the bottom part of the leg, that pressure can break the tail on top. To cut the pins, I set my marking gauge for the thickness of the tails, and then transfer that mark to the top of the leg. To lay out the pins, butt your rail tight to the leg. Now to do this, I scribe one side of the tail and then the back, and then wiggle the piece just enough to cover that first scribe line. Then I'll put the second line. That pretty much guarantees me a tight tail. Using my square, I extend those lines down to the scribe. I use this simple fixture while cleaning out the sockets on the leg. I begin by making small saw cuts. The bottom line, these saw cuts are so that I can see what I'm going to do with my router. Once these cuts are made, I lower the leg so that it's flush with the surface of the fixture. That gives me plenty of bearing surface for my router. With my router set to the proper depth, I route out the sockets, finish off with a chisel. To check, I'll use a dead blow to tap the dovetails in. To keep track of my parts, I use metal stamps. 1s are the right side of the table, 2 is the left. To lay out for the notch, I simply use a 1/4 inch chisel. That tells me what needs to be cut. Then I'll clear that material on the scroll saw. Now we'll have room for our tenon. Now's a good time to mark the back legs as well. Now we'll start working on the aprons. And the first step is to chisel off that little tab left from the machining process. To cut off these little tabs, I'm going to use a 1/2 inch chisel. It's important to use a chisel narrower than your apron stock. That way, if I dip one way or another, I'm not going to mar the visible edge. It might look odd the way I place it in the vise. Because the pressure's going in line, I don't have the risk of it rocking on me. At this point in time, we're going to abandon our extra pieces. We have them if we need them, hopefully we won't, but now there's no point in finishing them all out. Back at the table saw, I intentionally machined my tenons so they were a tight fit. Now it's time to size them by hand. For that, I'll use a pair of rabbet planes and a shooting board. When fitting the tenons, be very careful not to split the leg. Take the stock evenly off of both sides. And once I have a good fit, to keep track of my parts, I'll stamp them. In a systematic manner, I I fit all the tenons, working my way around. In the back corner, the tenons collide with each other, so they'll have to be marked so I can miter them. I'll use a power miter to cut the 45s on the tenons. It's always a good idea to chamfer the ends of the tenons. It helps make them slide in easier, and actually I think spreads the glue. We've chamfered all our tenons, our dovetails are done. Now it's time to do a dry fit, put the whole thing together and hope there's no surprises. I'll start out by putting the front together. Once that's good, I'll assemble the back. Insert the side aprons, and then put the front assembly on. After doing all the joinery, we need to just take care of some internals.
To learn how to build Steve Latta's side table from start to finish, become a member of finewoodworking.com. You'll gain access to our entire archive of video workshop projects, member-only videos, and over 40 years worth of fine woodworking articles.